My 7-year-old daughter grabbed the hem of her sweater and slowly pulled it up. My breath caught in my throat. Dark, purple, and yellow bruises painted her small ribs. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her whole body trembling, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "Uncle Daniel!" I gripped my phone so tightly my fingers hurt. My hands shook as I dialed my mother. I expected horror. I expected the fierce, protective rage of our family's billionaire matriarch. Instead, a dead silence hung on the line. Then her voice arrived, ice cold and perfectly steady. "Keep your mouth shut and do not ruin this family's reputation." The dial tone buzzed against my ear. I pressed the phone against my chest and stood there, frozen. I am 34 years old. I spend my days working as a 911 dispatcher. Panic, manipulation, and the absolute worst moments of people's lives are my daily soundtrack. My name is Rachel, and in that exact moment, I understood something with terrifying clarity. My own mother had just declared war on her own flesh and blood to protect a monster. By the next morning, the gaslighting campaign was already in full swing. Daniel moved with frightening speed. He called every aunt, uncle, and cousin in our sprawling family tree. He played the wounded, heartbroken uncle perfectly. He told them I was having a mental breakdown. He whispered that I was coaching my daughter Lily to invent stories because I was a bitter, struggling single mother desperate for a payout from the family trust. My mother, Victoria, provided the final seal of approval. She completely severed my emergency financial accounts. Then she sent a single, decisive message to the family group chat demanding total isolation. Anyone who spoke to me would be cut off permanently. My phone went dark. The notifications stopped. My entire support system vanished overnight. I stood in the center of my living room, staring at the blank screen of my phone. The air in the house suddenly felt thick and suffocating. I remembered being 12 years old, sitting quietly out of sight on the grand staircase of Victoria's estate. I listened to her tell her country club friends that I was the difficult child, the mistake, the one who never quite fit the family mold. Daniel was the golden boy, the untouchable heir. I was just the scapegoat. They crushed my spirit back then. They spent 2 decades convincing me that my voice had absolutely no value. I gripped the edge of the kitchen island until the cold granite bit into my palms. The pain grounded me. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to crawl back to the estate gates, sobbing and begging for forgiveness, pleading for a few scraps of their wealthy approval. But they forgot who I grew up to become. I deal with sociopaths, liars, and abusers for a living. I map out crises for terrified strangers every single night. I recognize the exact tone a predator uses when they believe they have permanently cornered their victim. Daniel and Victoria thought their billions could rewrite reality. They were wrong. I walked to the front door and slid the heavy metal deadbolt into place. I pulled every curtain in the house shut. I wiped the last moisture from my cheeks, sat down at the dining table, and opened my laptop. In that moment, I stopped being the exiled daughter. I turned my own bloodline into an active crime scene. That night, during my midnight shift, I sat at my dispatch console staring at the glowing monitor in front of me. The system held more than a decade of local emergency records. I bypassed the standard channels and quietly pulled the archived 911 logs for Oak Ridge Preparatory School. Red flags lit up the screen almost immediately. 4 separate child endangerment calls over the past 12 years. Every single one canceled mid-response by the local police chief. A single name buried deep inside one of the dismissed reports made my stomach twist. Naomi, the aunt who disappeared from our family photos 10 years ago. It took me 3 hours of digging to find her address. She was living 2 states away in a cramped, dim apartment building that smelled like old carpet and cigarette smoke. When she opened the door, she looked like a ghost of the vibrant woman I remembered. I sat on her faded couch and slid a photograph of Lily's bruised ribs across the scratched coffee table. Naomi stared at the picture for a long time. The color drained from her face. Her hands began shaking uncontrollably. She slowly stood up and walked toward a small rug in the corner of the room. Beneath it was a hidden floor safe. She unlocked it and pulled out a thick envelope. Without saying a word, she dropped it on the table in front of me. Inside was a legally binding non-disclosure agreement. $2 million. That was the exact price my mother paid 10 years ago to bury what Daniel did to Naomi's young son. Naomi backed away toward her bedroom, her face pale with panic. I'm taking the next flight to Vancouver. If Victoria finds out I gave you this, my life is over. Do not ever call me again. The bedroom door slammed shut in my face. I walked back to my car and sat behind the steering wheel, gripping it until my knuckles turned white. The envelope rested on the passenger seat, heavy with a sick and undeniable truth. People outside our world always wonder how a grandmother could look at her violently bruised granddaughter and choose to protect the man who did it. They assume it must be some twisted version of unconditional motherly love. It isn't love. Victoria protects Daniel because he is the golden face of her empire. Admitting what he truly is would stain the flawless billionaire legacy she spent her entire life building. To a true narcissist, the bruises on a child's ribs hurt far less than a public blemish on the family crest. My mother would gladly sacrifice Lily on the altar of reputation without losing a single minute of sleep. She was not a mother protecting a child, she was a chief executive officer protecting a corporate asset. I turned the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life. My mother wanted to protect her precious legacy. I decided it was time to burn it to the ground. I sent Daniel a single text message, asking him to come over. He arrived exactly 20 minutes later. He stepped through my front door wearing his signature cashmere coat and an utterly relaxed, smug grin. He walked straight into my living room and stood by the window, surveying my small house like a king inspecting a peasant's hut. He fully believed I was ready to wave the white flag. He forgot what state we live in. The law here only requires one party to consent to a recording. The microphone on my Apple Watch was already capturing every breath in the room. Daniel turned around and crossed his arms. "You really should have listened to Victoria," he sighed, using our mother's first name like they were corporate partners. "You're making a mess, Rachel, a completely pointless mess." I kept my expression completely blank. "Lily has bruises on her ribs, Daniel." He rolled his eyes like I had just interrupted his schedule with something trivial. "We paid Naomi $2 million to make her kids' little stories disappear. Do you honestly believe you can win against that kind of money, that kind of power?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a quiet, venomous whisper. "Keep pushing this, and I will take Lily away from you. Victoria has local judges on speed dial. You'll be locked inside a psychiatric ward before the weekend." A suffocating silence filled the room. He stared down at me, waiting for the tears, waiting for my knees to buckle. He expected the obedient, frightened little sister he used to control. He made a fatal miscalculation. When you threaten to rip a child away from her mother, you are no longer dealing with a polite relative bound by family loyalty. You strip away every ounce of hesitation. You remove the fear of losing an inheritance or a seat at the holiday table. You push a mother into a corner, and she stops being a citizen playing by society's rules. She becomes something far more dangerous, an apex predator. You threaten my little girl, and I will not simply fight back. I will strike the match and watch our entire family tree burn to white ash. I slowly forced the corners of my mouth into a calm, chilling smile. Then I stepped aside and pulled the front door wide open. "We're done here," I said quietly. Daniel smirked, adjusted his expensive collar, and strutted out into the afternoon sunlight, completely certain he had already won. I closed the door, looked down at my wrist, and saved the audio file. I was holding his legal death warrant. Now I just needed to get dressed for the Oak Ridge anniversary gala. I emptied my emergency savings jar onto the kitchen counter. $2,400 in crumpled 20s, 50s, and hundreds. It was every dollar I had left. I shoved the cash into a plain manila envelope along with a small black flash drive. Magic does not open doors in the real world. Desperation and cold hard cash do. The parking lot at the Oak Ridge anniversary gala was a sea of luxury cars, but I bypassed the grand entrance completely. I slipped around the building to the loading dock. A young audio-visual technician leaned against the brick wall, smoking a cigarette and staring at the ground like he hadn't slept in 2 days. I walked directly up to him and pressed the thick envelope against his chest, along with the flash drive. He blinked in confusion as he looked down at the money. "There's $2,400 in there," I said calmly. "Press play on that drive at exactly 8 o'clock, then walk out this door and do not stop driving. The FBI will be raiding this place tonight, and you do not want to be standing here when that happens." He swallowed hard, shoved the envelope into his pocket, and gave me a stiff nod. I slipped quietly into the back of the grand ballroom just minutes before the hour. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest elites sat at white linen tables sipping champagne and laughing softly. On the main stage, Daniel stood behind a crystal podium wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo and flashing his signature brilliant smile. He was in the middle of a passionate speech about family values and the sacred trust of shaping young minds. The clock struck 8. The microphone screeched loudly through the speakers. Daniel tapped the mic, his smile flickering for a fraction of a second. Behind him, the massive projection screen flickered. The slideshow of smiling students disappeared. In its place appeared a high-resolution scan of Naomi's $2 million non-disclosure agreement, every signature, every clause, blazing across the screen for 500 billionaires to read. Before the crowd could even process the document, the ballroom speakers crackled to life. Daniel's own recorded voice filled the hall. "We paid Naomi $2 million to make her kids' little stories disappear. Do you really think you can win against that kind of money, that kind of power?" The silence inside the ballroom turned heavy and suffocating. I kept my eyes locked on Daniel. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sick gray color. His hands began shaking so violently the crystal podium rattled. Sweat formed across his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic gasp came out. The microphone slipped from his trembling fingers and slammed onto the wooden stage with a deafening crack. The crowd exploded into chaos. Gasps turned into angry whispers. Wealthy donors scrambled away from their chairs, backing away from the stage like Daniel carried some contagious disease. Across the room, my mother sat frozen at the head table. Victoria's perfect posture had collapsed. Her eyes were locked on the giant screen in pure horror. The immaculate billion-dollar empire she sacrificed her granddaughter to protect was shattering into a million pieces right in front of her. I turned and calmly walked out of the ballroom doors. 24 hours later, flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of my living room. I stood by the front window holding Lily tightly against my side. At the end of my driveway sat my mother's sleek black Maybach. Its engine purred quietly under the streetlights. The tinted windows remained completely dark. She sat in the climate-controlled back seat, sipping sparkling water while her hired mercenaries did the dirty work. Heavy fists pounded at my front door. The local police chief stood on my porch alongside a woman from Child Protective Services. He held a piece of paper up to the pier hole, a completely forged psychiatric evaluation. Victoria had paid her private concierge doctor to declare me dangerously unstable. She planned to drag my daughter out of my home in the middle of the night to silence me forever. The chief raised his boot to kick in my door. He never finished the motion. The deafening scream of sirens shattered the quiet street. 3 massive black SUVs tore around the corner and slammed to a stop, boxing the Maybach against the curb. Men in tactical vests jumped out and rushed across the lawn. Federal insignias glowed on their jackets under the streetlights. They ignored the police chief completely and marched straight to the luxury car. The lead agent slammed his fist against the tinted window. My mother rolled it down, her face twisted with arrogant fury. The agent shoved a federal warrant directly into her chest. She had used a federally insured bank to cover up a felony, turning it into a federal crime. The agents pulled her out of the vehicle in her designer gown and snapped cold steel handcuffs around her wrists. By the end of that week, the doctor who forged my psychiatric evaluation permanently lost his medical license. The sirens faded into the night as the SUVs drove away. I kissed the top of Lily's head, turned away from the window, and walked back into the quiet safety of our home. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block months later, echoing through the cavernous federal courtroom and finalizing the complete destruction of my family's empire. The judge showed absolutely no mercy. Daniel was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole. The charges included multiple counts of severe child endangerment and federal wire fraud. The court also ordered him to pay $2 million in restitution to Naomi and her son, draining his accounts completely dry. My mother faced her own spectacular downfall. The woman who spent her entire life polishing her public image received a 4-year sentence in a minimum security federal correctional facility for obstruction of justice and corporate financial crimes. But the prison sentence barely registered on her face. The true lethal blow came from the federal prosecutors. Using aggressive civil asset forfeiture laws, the government seized the entire $85 million family trust fund. They froze the offshore accounts. They auctioned the grand historic estate. The source of her power evaporated overnight. The social fallout was merciless. The board of directors at Oak Ridge Preparatory School voted unanimously to dissolve the institution rather than face the massive public relations disaster. Victoria's elite country club quietly revoked her lifetime membership within 48 hours of her very public arrest. During the agonizing 6-week trial, the gallery benches behind my mother remained completely empty. The billionaire friends, the politicians she funded, the relatives she paid off, every single one of them disappeared like smoke in a hurricane. They abandoned her the second her money dried up. The pristine legacy she sacrificed her own granddaughter to protect became nothing more than a cautionary headline on the evening news. 8 months later, the crisp autumn air rolled into our new neighborhood. I stood by the kitchen island sorting through the morning mail when a plain white envelope caught my eye. The return address carried the sterile stamped ink of a federal correctional institution. It was a letter from Victoria. 3 pages of tightly packed, furious handwriting. She offered no apology for Lily's bruised ribs, not even a single word of regret. Instead, she poured out a bitter stream of guilt and manipulation. She complained about her declining health and the terrible prison food. She reminded me of the expensive roof she gave me for 18 years. Then she ended the letter with a venomous plea. I am still your mother. I did what I had to do for our legacy. You destroyed this family, Rachel. You need to fix this. A year ago, those words would have crushed me. They would have sent me spiraling into days of guilt and self-doubt. I would have questioned my own worth. But today, my pulse remained steady. My breathing stayed slow and calm. I felt absolutely nothing. I folded the pages, walked into my home office, and fed the entire envelope into the steel blades of the paper shredder. The machine hummed loudly as it shredded her final attempt at control into meaningless white confetti. I dumped the shredded paper into the recycling bin, walked back into the kitchen, and poured myself a cup of hot coffee. Then I stepped out onto the back porch. The morning sun warmed the wooden deck. Lily sat in the middle of the lawn, giggling uncontrollably while my shift supervisor from the dispatch center chased her around with a garden hose. The backyard was loud, chaotic, and full of life. Half a dozen of my coworkers relaxed around a smoking barbecue grill, laughing while they passed bowls of potato salad and paper plates. None of these people share a single strand of DNA with me, but when the nightmare began, they were the ones who showed up. They brought groceries when my bank accounts were frozen. They sat beside me during the darkest nights. They formed a protective wall around my little girl.
I looked at the cheap plastic patio chairs and mismatched paper cups scattered across the deck. Then I thought about the silent marble dining room inside Victoria's estate where we ate prime rib beneath crystal chandeliers while pretending the monsters at the table were saints. I have never felt richer than I do standing on this worn wooden porch. Peace is incredibly quiet, but it is the most expensive thing I have ever owned. If you are listening to this and you are exhausted from carrying the heavy, toxic secrets of your own family, hear me clearly. Wealthy, narcissistic families operate exactly like cults. They demand silence as the price of their love. They convince you that protecting their public reputation is more important than protecting your own safety. I walked through that fire and I came back with 3 truths. First, the truth about blood. Society teaches us that sharing DNA means unconditional loyalty. That is a lie. DNA is nothing more than biology. Safety, respect, and protection, those are what create a real family. You are allowed to walk away from people who harm you, even if you share their last name. Trust is earned through actions, not owed through a birth certificate. Second, the weapon of sunlight. Abusers and manipulators survive in darkness. They rely on your shame and your silence to keep their empires running. The moment you stop protecting their secrets, their power disappears. Your strongest weapon against toxic power is exposure. Bring the truth into the open. Show the documents. Speak the truth loudly and let the world decide. Third, the maternal boundary. No institution, no billionaire trust fund, and no social pressure is stronger than a mother's instinct to protect her child. When someone threatens what you love most, you stop asking for permission to survive. You become the storm that wipes them away. I sometimes think about the little girl who once sat on the grand staircase begging for scraps of approval from people who despised her. She doesn't exist anymore. The fire burned her away and left behind a woman made of iron. Now, I want you to look at your own life for a moment. Look at the people sitting around your dinner table. How much of your soul are you sacrificing just to protect a toxic definition of family? How many bruises are being hidden just to keep the peace? If you have ever had to walk away from your own bloodline just to survive, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Let the world know that choosing your own safety over a toxic legacy is never a betrayal. It is victory. Most people scroll past stories like this. The ones who subscribe are the ones trying to change something inside themselves. If this made you stop scrolling, subscribe to get more stories like this every day. And don't forget to comment below and share this story with someone you care about.